Hey, welcome to my desk here at Worst Tutorials HQ. Last week, Bradford and I uploaded a video where he ran his stereo pedal board into the Axe-FX 3 and experienced Axe-FX 3 with his pedal board for the first time. Link below to catch that video. The cool thing about that video was how Brad sets his effects up. So Brad likes to run his wet effects, reverb and delay, in front of the amp. So the amp basically affects his wet effects, which is different than how, like, if you have any of our, most of our Helix patches, all of the reverbs and delays are after the amps. It's two completely different sounds, really, that you can get with it. And I think in the video, I made some statement like, when you put reverbs and delays in front of amps, like in Helix and Axe-FX, it never quite gets that sound. Would you agree?
Yeah.
Well, especially, I haven't really tried it on Axe-FX, but in Helix, that's the case.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to make this video for a couple reasons. One, to prove myself wrong, because I have done it. I'm pointing at HX Edit here on my computer screen, and it sounds awesome. It sounds like what Bradford had going on with wet effects in front of the Axe-FX, or when he runs it into Kemper, that kind of thing. It sounds like the albums and the recordings that we've all heard from, like Bethel and Hillsong, where all those guys that record, at least live, they run their boards into their amps. So all their wet effects are in front of the amps. It has a very distinct sound. So I wanted to make this video to show you that, yes, you can do it. It sounds great. To give you a few tips and tricks on how to do it if you want to set this up in your own patches. So to demonstrate this, I have built two patches in Helix, and one of these is probably going to end up being a Worst Tutorials patch, probably the one with the effects in front. What I've done is I've taken the AC30, because it's my favorite, and I have paired it with Tone Junkie has made an IR pack from Jonathan got a 1966 AC30 top boost with silver bell speakers, really highly coveted, sought after speakers, and he's made IRs from them. And I've used the IRs in these patches from that pack, and they sound awesome. Gives it a different flavor. I've called it the 66 AC. So I have a patch called 66 AC Post. That means wet effects are after the amp. So you can see here's the amp, here are the IRs, here are the wet effects, all of them on the bottom. I have also made a patch called 66 AC Pre. Here are the amps, here are the IRs, wet effects are all in front of them. Now, here's the first difficulty with the Helix and wet effects in front of the amps. It's a DSP thing. If your wet effects are stereo, you can't run stereo effects into a single amp and retain your stereo imaging. It will sum to mono. So you have to run into two amps and two IRs. So what I've done here is, you can see I have set these amps up with exactly the same settings. The only thing that's different, you'll see the channel volume moves a little bit. That was just to balance levels from the IRs. I could have done it in the IR block. In fact, I did a little bit. But the amps are set exactly the same, and they're running into these IRs. If you go into the AC Post patch, if you take a screenshot and look here, the amp settings are pretty much identical except for one thing. And the IRs are also the same two IRs. So you get basically the same core amp tone out of these two patches. I'm going to play you just a little bit of clean tone just so you can hear it and experience that they do sound pretty much the same. Here is the AC Post. Here's the AC Pre, same reverb, same delays, quarter note delay, hall reverb, amp is basically clean. Now to my ears, those two sounds are pretty much identical. I did say there's one change. If you look at the gain level on the amps with wet effects in front, the low version of drive is at 6.1. What I've done is I have a button set to turn the gain up on the amp. So the gain on the pre version, oops, I gotta go up here. The drive setting goes from 6.1 to 7.5. If you go to the AC post, so with wet effects after the amp, the drive goes from 5 to 6.7. So I found that I had to turn the drive on the amp up by about 1 to get the same level of drive when my wet effects were in front of the amp. I don't know why that is. Maybe I've got something different with this EQ block or the compressor, but I've pretty much got it all set the same. For some reason, I needed to turn the gain up to sort of match them gain-wise. So let's listen to the bigger wet effects pre and post. So here they are post. I have this glitz reverb. Here you can see my settings for the glitz reverb. One thing to really pay attention to is this mix level, 23%, and then the sort of the depth, crossover, and mod mix are all different, and the high and low cuts are different. So this is what the glitz sounds like after the amps. Pretty big reverb. All right, here's that same glitz reverb, but in the pre-patch, so now it's in front of the amp. Notice I took my decay time down by about half a second. The high cut is way down to 4.1K. Not way down, it's down by, I think it was around 5K on the other one. My low cut is way up to 260 hertz. I'm rolling a lot of low end out of it before it hits the amp. And these rate crossover are all a little different, but the mix is at 18%. So that's quite a drop on the mix. It might not sound like a lot, but if you know these reverbs in the Helix, there's a big difference between that 5-ish% in there. Here's how it sounds in front of the amp. So it sounds pretty much the same. It's a little less prevalent at lower gain settings, and that's important to note because as we increase the gain, you're going to hear way more of a difference, and you're going to hear these sort of the wet effects stand out more with more gain. I think it's because it's a compression thing. They just get brought up in the mix a little more when they're in front of the amp. So the first tip is you have to sort of change the EQs on the reverbs and the delays. And you have to lower the mix levels when you put them in front of the amp because the amp, I suspect it's a compression thing. The amp is compressing that reverb trail and it's bringing it up. So it sounds like it's higher in the mix. Okay, so next let's look at delay. I have an Adriatic delay set at dotted eighth note. This is in the patch where it comes after the amp. Notice the mix level is at 50% on this one and it sounds like this. Okay, so here it is in the patch pre-amp. You'll notice the mix level is now at 42%. So it went from 50% all the way down to 42%. Again, doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually a big change on this delay in the Helix. It sounds like this. So you can see it actually sounds like it's a little hotter than in the one post-amp. So again, mix had to come down for it to be basically at the same level as it was after the amps. One thing about it is when you're playing with cleaner sounds, you're not going to notice the difference as much as with dirty sounds, and that's where you really get that thing that happens with wet effects in front of the amp. So I'm going to go to the Praise and Worship lead snapshot just to show this off. So now what we've got is, let me turn this off so you're here. All right, that's how you know it's going to be good when you hear right before you start playing. So the drive on the amps are up now. There's only one amp in this patch, of course. So I've got the amp drive on, 808 reverb, 808 reverb, 808 drive. I've got a dual delay here. It's a eighth note and dotted eighth note. Same thing with the dual delay. I had to change the EQ and mix settings, post versus pre. And then the big glitz verb. And I'll just play a Bethel thing. So here it is, not sounding quite like Bethel because Bethel is, you know, that's when I think of this sound. I hear it in Bethel stuff. You really hear that sort of overdriven, grindy, dirty reverb trail. It's cool sound. But here it is after amps. Okay, let's do that same thing. Now all the wet effects are after the amp, but it's the same stuff, basically. Amp gain, 808 drive, dual delay, glitz reverb. Here we go. That sounded more like Bethel to me. It had that thing, and what that thing really is your delay trails are, it's almost like there's overdrive on your delay trails, which is actually a thing you can do in the Helix with parallel processing. Notice, man, all that low end, I rolled a bunch of low end out of there. Like it's a 260 hertz low cut on this glitz reverb, but I still heard a lot more low end, on the reverb itself when it was in front of those amps. I don't know. Again, I think it's a compression thing. But here they are. These are my settings. You can steal them, copy them, put them in your patches if you want. Like I said, I think this AC 66 AC stereo patch is going to be the next one of the next ones from Worship Tutorials. I already sent it to Bradford. Said do your magic on it. Just a few closing thoughts about it. You might have noticed here in the AC pre patch, I have a gain block at the end. One thing I've found is that, and I think it's because the delays and reverbs themselves are able to be louder when they're after the amp. So I had to put a gain block in on my lead sound. I pushed it by 2 dB to get the same sort of level as I was able to get with that same snapshot with the wet effects after. So that's one thing to notice. Everything kind of becomes, you know, your dynamic range kind of gets smaller, which can be a good thing, you know, depending on what you're going for. It kind of puts you in a tighter spectrum as far as all your tones go. But I had to adjust volume with that to get the same level for the lead sound. Delays, in my opinion, when you run them in front of the amp, delay trails can be a little bit harder to distinguish. So in my dual delay, for example, I had to brighten it up for when I put it in front of the amp. So I adjusted the high cut and rolled it back, the high cut, so more highs came through. That allowed me to hear the repeats a little better. Because again, it's just getting compressed, it's getting, you know, slammed together with everything else in the amps. Whereas if they're after the amps, it kind of has a little more room to breathe. You could think of it that way. So here's a question for you. How do you set your stuff up? A lot of us who grew up playing with pedals and a pedal board into an amp or real amps, we put wet effects in front just because it's a lot harder to put them after the amp in a real world setting. You either have to take the mic'd sound from the amp and run that signal through effects, which is hard to do. You have to have them either, you know, it's a lot of cable management, or if you had an amp with an effects loop, you could do it that way. But the effects loop would put the wet effects between the preamp and the cabs, so it's not exactly the same. Which you could do in the Helix very easily. You could just put your effects between the amp and the cab. It's basically like having an effects loop set up in the real world. But I think for a lot of us, it was just because it was a convenience thing. That's just, you had a board and you ran it into an amp. All your wet effects are in front of the amp. But, you know, like I said, in all these live recordings that we've heard over the years from Hillsong, Bethel, everything, all these players run boards into amps, and so the wet effects are in front. It's a sound that we've become conditioned to hearing. It's a really cool sound, and to get that sound, you have to set it up like that in the Helix. I hope this has been helpful for you if that's something that you've wanted to do. Hey, I like this format, sitting here at the desk talking about modeling stuff, tips and tricks. If there's anything you want to know, let me know in the comments below. Really what I've wanted to do is a series of videos like this focused on Line 6 and fractal stuff, because those are the two worlds that I live in the most. And I feel like there's some things that I've learned along the way that would be good to share. This one just came up because we did the video last week, and I thought, I have got to figure out how to get wet effects in front of the amps sounding great, which I think we've done. So thanks again for watching. Hey, subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next one.